think I'm going to go ahead. We already have a healthy number as people stream in. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this all-star crisis group panel today to try to unpack the really dramatic events that we saw on the weekend. We'll have a moderated discussion with my colleagues, and then in about 40 minutes or so, you'll be able to ask questions. So please, start putting your questions in the Q&A, and I'll take a look, and do state your affiliation, your name, so we know where things are coming from, or I'll do my best. This is a recorded event, and it's live. It will be live streamed on Crisis Group's YouTube channel, so you can take a look there or thereafter if you want to tell friends to take a look. Obviously, Russians and the Kremlin are still reeling from the events over the weekend and the chaos that we saw. It's worth restating just how shocking the events were for Russians, but also for Putin. All the more so because the challenge came from one of his loyalists, a man so indebted to Putin that he was known as Putin's chef, and he then turned into Putin's war dog. This is going to be a very difficult thing for Putin's propagandists to easily blame on the West. The Kremlin has been doing damage control in the last few days, but this is certainly not the end of the story. So we think the shockwaves are going to take some time to play out, and Putin must know how he acts next, and how allies and others in Russia do is going to be pivotal to his grip on power and probably impact the war in Ukraine. So to help me unpack all of this today, we have Olya Olekar, who is the program director for the Europe and Central Asia program at the International Crisis Group. We have our senior Russia analyst, Oleg Ignatov. We have Simon Schlegel, who is in Ukraine as our senior Ukraine analyst. And I'm very happy to have someone outside of our team, but still in our organization, Pauline Bax, who has been tracking Wagner's across Africa. She is the Crisis Group Africa Deputy Program Director. So with that, I think I will get straight into the meat of things. Olya, if I may, there have been quite a number of lessons to draw from the events of the last few days, from the risks that this shows up for a long war, to the flaws and cracks in Putin's management style, to the support for Prigozhin, possibly within Russia. What do you think are the main conclusions to draw from, although it's still early days, from what's happened?
So I think the thing I find striking, and I'm going to find things striking based on my own biases and how I look at things, but what I find really interesting about this is that we've seen well over a decade of pretty significant crackdowns in Russia that were meant to limit opposition to Putin's rule. Those crackdowns were increasingly focused on what we might call the left, right, on liberal activists. For a while, there were also pretty significant limitations on the right, on far-right groups, on white power type groups, but that has eased over time, right? So as Oleg has written, what we've seen is that especially recently, especially since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the only opposition that was allowed in Russia was opposition from the right. And indeed, when you actually got a serious uprising, that was where it came from. And, if you think about it, people holding up empty pieces of paper, blank pieces of paper in city squares aren't that big a threat to the Kremlin, where as an armed group led by people with who think that violence and masculinity are the same, and who have long emphasized violence, which are violent by nature, when they get angry, well, you might expect that violence would be the way that their anger shows through. And this is where the threat has come from. And what I find really interesting is that the response, so far at least, has been one that suggests a certain amount of nervousness about these people, that it's not an immediate crackdown on them, it is a very gentle approach. Now, maybe that's going to lead up to a crackdown later, but at least for now, it sends the signal that violence is met with conciliation. And, we'll see what happens next. I think it's too early to assume that that's all there is to it, but it's an interesting outcome.
Thank you. So, Oleg, I want to turn to you because, understanding what comes next really depends on really understanding what happened. There's a lot that's still unknown about the deal that was cut, supposedly by Lukashenko, between Prigozhin and Putin. There have been reports in the media that some of this had been planned for days and that US intelligence, possibly the FSB, were aware of things, although we saw no opposition, virtually no opposition to Prigozhin's sort of thundering towards Moscow. So what do we know? What don't we know? What happened?
So yes, what happened is the main question here. Yes, and what we know. Yes, we know that Russia didn't prepare for a long war in Ukraine. So it prepared for a very short operation, and it planned to take over Ukraine for 2 or 3 weeks. Yes, when the initial plan failed, and it happened in the end of February, in the beginning of March, Prigozhin came to Ukraine. So it happened in March 2022. And in March 2022, he helped Putin to solve his problem because the army wasn't prepared. And it seems that he proposed this idea to hire prisoners, or maybe he was told to propose this idea to hire prisoners to Wagner. But we don't know, this is the questions, but he started hiring prisoners. He was deployed in the Lugansk region, and Prigozhin was very successful at this stage of the operation. Yes, he helped Russia to take over the Lugansk region of Ukraine. He behaved so the Wagner acted very successfully, and Ukrainians acknowledged this. And after that, Prigozhin was getting stronger and stronger. And at some stage of this story, he proposed Putin to make a big Wagner, to hire about 200,000 people to Wagner, maybe prisoners, maybe volunteers, but it was open. He said this on the record. So to create the second big army, to deploy this army in Ukraine, and to solve all of the Putin's problems in Ukraine. So of course, if Prigozhin is successful, he would become the biggest figure in the Russian elite. So the second after Putin, the winner of this war. But we don't know why, but Putin rejected this idea. Maybe he rejected this idea directly, so saying Prigozhin that it's not possible. Maybe he did this through Shoigu. But at some point of this conflict, at some stage of this conflict, it was in February 2023, Prigozhin lost his ability to hire prisoners to Wagner. And after that, he started recording different videos that he didn't have enough of shells, that he didn't have enough of equipment. And he also said that the Wagner Group might disappear in the future. And after that, so after all of this, after a lot of these videos, after a lot of these recordings, then it was decided that all volunteers, so again, it means Wagner, because Wagner they are volunteers, should sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense. So they meant all the volunteers who are fighting in Ukraine, not outside Ukraine, yes, not in the Central African Republic or somewhere in Africa. Of course, Prigozhin didn't like this idea, and he rejected this idea again openly. And he said that he was not going to sign the contract with the military. And after that, Prigozhin started his rebellion. So it seems that he really wanted to capture Shoigu and Gerasimov and Rostov. They got to know about that in advance, and they disappeared. Yes, but why, for example, did the FSB and the GRU didn't act at this stage? If Gerasimov and Shoigu knew about the rebellion, we don't know. and why Putin didn't act also when he got to know on Friday. So it seems that we don't know again, but it seems that Prigozhin was not going to oust Putin, yes, or at least he was not pretending to do this. Yes, his goal was to reclaim the contract, to reclaim his contract by force, trying to capturing Shoigu and Gerasimov in Rostov. And maybe it happened because when Putin decided that Wagner would not exist in Ukraine, he apparently didn't inform Prigozhin personally. Yes, nor did he offer him some kind of compensation. So it seems that Putin could prevent this crisis in advance, but he didn't do it. And Prigozhin recorded a lot of videos and audios that Putin was disinformed, that Gerasimov and Shoigu were lying to Putin. Yes, and it seems that he wanted to convince Putin that he was being deceived and that Wagner should continue to exist because Gerasimov and Shoigu were not effective. But Putin didn't pay attention to him. Again, we don't know if they communicated with each other before the conflict. So therefore, the first version of what happened is like this story was like a gesture of desperation on Prigozhin's part. He was not planning to overthrow Putin. He may even hoped that Putin would support him. Yes, and when he found out that Shoigu and Gerasimov were lying to him. So for Prigozhin, it could be like, in his understanding, like a tough bureaucratic fight by no bureaucratic means, yes, by military means. But when Putin didn't support Prigozhin, when he declared him as a traitor, so Prigozhin, again, was desperate, and he declared his march to Moscow, in which he didn't participate. He stayed all the time in Rostov. But after that, he realized that he overplayed. He made a deal with Putin. And this is the first version. And this is like Prigozhin's version, which he recorded on Monday. Yes, the second version is that Prigozhin is like a part of larger conspiracy, or that Prigozhin was advised someone to act, that somebody told Prigozhin that he should act and that he would be supported by Putin. But again, there are a lot of unknowns here. Yeah. It's hard to imagine that the GRU and the FSB didn't know about this. It's hard to imagine, yes, that these people would not see any crackdowns on them when Putin knows about this conspiracy. Yes. So again, why? And the third version is that Prigozhin really wanted to oust Putin and to take over Moscow, to take over the power in Moscow. And it seems that he had such a possibility.
So it wouldn't be Russia if there wasn't a version in which Putin orchestrated all of this, and it was in his interest in the end. Certainly, that's not how it's been read by many in Russia and the rumor mill, as you pointed out, and the kind of blow, the perceived blow to Putin's image that we've heard and that we've seen from the comments, both within Russia but without, especially without, are really interesting. So I just, we'll come back to a lot of this because hopefully in the discussion, but I also want to kind of come to the foreign policy implications, possibly of the instability and of the challenge to Putin's leadership. So Prigozhin was a man who built his reputation not in the last year only in Ukraine, but from his long relationship and association to Putin. And when he began with the internet troll agency and sort of meddling in elections abroad, to then expanding his sway in Syria, in Libya, and finally really taking a real foothold in Africa. So, arguably what happens to Wagner is most important to developments in some African states. Pauline, could you talk a bit about the reaction there and the kind of sense going forward?
Well, we haven't seen many reactions yet in Africa itself. Of course, I think it's safe to assume that the governments who have hired Wagner want to see sort of how, want to see how this plays out. You know, just like everybody else, we don't really know what's going to happen with Wagner. The Central African Republic, the government of Central African Republic has said, like, we'll have a defense agreement with Russia, and so does Mali, where Wagner is also present. So these defense agreements, of course, are in place, which means Russian military cooperation, supply of arms, those kinds of things. So these are unlikely to change. And then in CAR, we have about 1,500 men, Wagner men on the ground. In Mali, about 1,000, 1,500. We don't have the exact figures, but let's say it's less than 3,000. Wagner has been extremely useful for the Kremlin. Wagner in Africa has been extremely useful for the Kremlin, obviously. And I think we should assume, even though we don't know, that this is not going to change right away. Just to go back a little bit in history, some of the Central African Republic got Wagner actually by first having Russian military instructors a couple of years back. And these official Russian military instructors were gradually replaced by Wagner people. So we could maybe speculate that, you know, Wagner men would either sign up with the army or sign up like officially, or then be replaced by other soldiers or volunteers of some sort who can do the work that Wagner is doing in Central African Republic and Mali, which is providing presidential security and providing security to those people who are in power, which is extremely important, of course, for the governments that we talk about, as well as trying to expand, you know, business interests in the country, logging, diamond mining, those kinds of things. Again, these things are all extremely useful for the Kremlin, and Wagner is not a threat. Wagner in Africa is, I think, not a threat for the Kremlin as it is. It's just very useful. So again, we're still speculating about what could happen, but generally, I'm sure people want to see how this is going to play out, hoping that Wagner will stay.
Thank you, Pauline. You know, I've seen a lot of questions already in the Q&A about the impact for Africa, so maybe we'll go into more detail later. But I do want to say, if Wagner continues in some shape or form in Africa, it's certainly not going to in the same way for the fight for Ukraine. We've already seen reports about, you know, Wagner finally given the choice to join the Russian military. How has this all been greeted by leaders in Kiev, and what are the initial reactions there and hopes from what we've seen develop? Simon?
I think the sense of disbelief that has afflicted us all, I think that was also the case here in Kiev. I'm not sure that the Ukrainians were in the know, and it's going to be a very interesting question why they were not in the know. If the Americans and the British did know about this, apparently, but the first reaction was Dmitry Kuleba, the foreign minister, tweeting that we should no longer be afraid of any kind of escalation, that Russia under pressure would fold, and that you know, this is a hollow shell of a government. Of course, that was before the deal with Prigozhin, but it's very clear now that Ukraine will take this argument on tour, saying that this is a government that can fold under pressure, and we should try to make it fold. One way to do this is to stoke military frustration in Russia. Further, the Ukrainians will try to do that, maybe not just by taking back as much territory as they can over the next few days. There has been added dynamic to the counteroffensive quite clearly since June 24th, but also perhaps by doing that in the places where it frustrates Russia most. That would be in and around Bakhmut, where we've seen the biggest land gains over the last couple of days, where, of course, Wagner has lost so many men over the winter in a victory that has always been questioned what the strategic value of that is. Another argument that I think that Ukrainian government will take to Western capitals is not to be identified with these narratives of Russia that are there for plausible deniability, right? All of these fronts from the Russian government like the Wagner Group, that has been exposed through this mutiny as a fully government-funded scheme. Any of this will be called out, and the Ukrainians will definitely rely on this example to say, like, this government is not to be trusted. The same is true if, of course, there will be consequences now for either Prigozhin or Surovikin. This will be another example for the Ukrainians to say that the Russian government cannot be trusted. Any security guarantees from the Russian government are not worth the paper that they're printed on. And in any future deal, if there ever should be one, we will have to have hard security guarantees besides just Putin's word.
Thank you, Simon. I'd like to come back to Olya on some of that, in the sense that, what's said in Kiev and what's hoped for from Western backers is really quite different a view sometimes from the way in which diplomats and politicians are viewing this in Western capitals. What kind of worry and concern have we seen there? How do you think that this is going to affect the conversation around support for Ukraine, especially, Olya? You're muted.
Sorry about that. So I think in capitals and in government buildings, people are having the same sorts of conversations we're having here virtually right now. They're piecing the pieces together, and they're trying to understand what it means and what conclusions are the right conclusions to draw and what conclusions are the wrong conclusions. You could certainly make an argument, for instance, that Vladimir Putin's conciliatory response to this insurrection suggests that the way to deal with the Kremlin is to push harder, right? That this is an argument for more escalation on the part of Ukraine and potentially its Western backers. Another argument that is being made is that we've heard, I think I saw French President Macron cited as saying something to this effect, that this shows not just that the Russian government is brittle, but also there are people ostensibly worse than Putin that could come in and take power. And this is worrying, right? So we want to be careful. You can draw a lot of conclusions from this. I think one of the conclusions you're not going to get a very strong argument for is that this means that Ukraine should negotiate with Russia, right? I mean, this is the debate that's been going on all along. And of course, it assumes that Russians are interested in negotiating, which we've seen absolutely no evidence of. But there's nothing about what's happened that suggests that Ukraine ought to give up right now. I think the question is how hard to push, when, and under what conditions. But if, for instance, you're thinking that if you want to test Russian resolve, right, if you want to see if command and control and morale in the military are really strong, then effectiveness in Ukraine's counteroffensive would be a really good way to test that. But I think that also assumes the ability to do it, and we'll see if that's the path that Kiev takes. And as for Western capitals, NATO member states are gearing up for the summit of the alliance in Vilnius in just a couple of weeks. And the question of the day there is what they're going to say about prospective Ukrainian NATO membership and what kind of commitments they're going to make to Ukraine's defense going forward. And on the second, I'm very confident that there will be lots of commitments to Ukraine's defense going forward. And on the first, I've got to say, there are a lot of different possibilities. And I think that what happened over the weekend is going to be taken by people on all sides of the debate and pointed to as evidence for their own arguments against the others.
Thank you, Olya. I want to come back to Oleg. We've got already quite a number of questions about what this means for Wagner's future. So Could we just go a bit more technical and, what is the latest news? What's happening with Wagner's forces? I mean, it's an interesting choice to join the MOT. What do you expect from those, or how many of those will perhaps go to Belarus with Wagner? And we had an interesting question also. I'm jumping to these slowly. About whether it was actually Prigozhin who was shown to be weak rather than Putin. Is this the way that you see it, Oleg?
Well, so I think that the Wagner, so it will not exist, but it hasn't existed like it existed since the beginning of the war. Yes, because the Russian government, before the war in Ukraine, the Russian government never recognized that the Wagner was part of the Russian government. And yesterday, Putin revealed that the Russian government paid for Wagner. That's the Wagner was under Russia's government payroll, and it's a completely new situation. Yes, it's difficult now to hide your presence when you recognize that it's part of it's a government's body. Yes, and the Wagner will not exist like it existed before the conflict, before the war. Yes, and now this is a new situation. It seems that they are really going to disband Wagner. So everybody who would like to stay in Russia and who is in Russia or in Ukraine would have to sign a contract with their Russian military. We don't know what happened with those who are in Africa. Yes, maybe we'll see a lot of new judicial entities and a lot of people who are signing contracts with these new judicial entities. Or maybe the Russian military would also have to recognize that these are Russian forces right now. They call them the Russian instructors right now. Yes, they don't say they're mercenaries. They don't say they are private military company. They say that they are Russian instructors, and maybe they will have a status as Russian instructors. But the Wagner in Ukraine and in Russia, it seems it will disappear. Yes, and of course, I think they learned the lesson. I mean, that the Kremlin learned the lesson that they need to get rid of all of this private military structures, or at least to control their growth. Yes, what will happen with those who are going to stay? I think there are two problems. The first problem is with the military. You know that the real Wagner commanders are former Russian military, and I think they have their own ethics, and it will not be difficult for them to comply with orders from the Minister of Defense and to be part of the Minister of Defense again, as they were before. Yes, and the second problem are the former prisoners. So there are no former prisoners in Africa, yes, and in the Middle East, but there are former prisoners in Ukraine and in Russia. So what will they decide to do? Because they understand if you sign a contract with the Russian Minister of Defense, it could be timeless. Yes, you will not, it will be difficult to resign. Yes, but if you're on Wagner, you sign a contract for 6 months and you will resign with money. And now, if you are part of the military and you are going to resign, it will be difficult to do because the president's decree on mobilization is still it acts, so it's still there. Yes, and if they choose a freedom in Belarus or a military service in the Russian army in the middle of the big war, we don't know. So the problem with these people could appear. Yes, that's true. And what was the second question? Sorry.
It was a sort of a question about Wagner's future, and also whether Prigozhin and Prigozhin's future tied to it, whether he was actually shown to have sort of won something of the day. Although I say I wouldn't really want to be in his shoes right now, but I don't know what you think, Oleg.
So if we believe the official version, of course, Prigozhin lost. Yes, maybe he lost all of his business. He lost Wagner, but Wagner was only the part of his business. Yes, it was a big part of his business, but not the main one. Yes, he has a real estate business, he has restaurants, he has all of this catering business. He was the main supplier for food for the Minister of Defense, for for school children. So he has a huge business, and he has his own media empire. He has the troll factory, and as was said, it's the biggest troll factory in Russia with about 500 people who work there. So we don't know what will happen with all of these people. So that's also a very interesting question.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting point to bring up, especially when it comes to discussing Russia's power projection abroad, including in Africa, right? Wagner's forces came with with disinformation, and sometimes Russia interceding in the information space there. So I just want to come back to that from a sort of wider picture than just Wagner's involvement and Russia's involvement in conflicts there. But if this whole episode focused minds and had people speaking in a way they hadn't for years about the possibility of a post-Putin Russia, what does that mean for Putin's alliances elsewhere? I mean, there's been a fairly robust set of countries that have refused to take sides quite clearly in the Ukraine war, or have maintained their links to Russia. So Pauline, from where you're sitting, perhaps you could speak about South Africa or some of the countries that haven't made that clear-cut choice.
Well, I think in Africa and most African countries who feel sympathy for Russia, and those who feel sympathy for Russia and are thinking about hiring Wagner or have hired Wagner, don't really make a distinction between Wagner and Russia. To them, Wagner is Russia. So if Wagner disappears as a brand, the loyalty to Russia will remain. So I think that's fairly simple. It doesn't really matter what brand name it comes. Specifically Mali and CAR desperately need, or desperately think they desperately need, the help that Wagner has brought in. If this is being replaced by Russian help, or additional Russian help in terms of helicopters or weapons or whatever, it doesn't really matter how it comes. Just in terms of troops, and that doesn't really answer your question, but the interesting thing, at least with the Wagner troops in CAR, there's a lot of Chechens and Syrians, and not all of those guys who are there are Russians, but maybe eventually they can be replaced by some type of other Russian volunteers. I don't really see how that will work. Oleg will know that much better than me, but I just wanted to point that out, that not everybody who is labeled in Africa as Russian is necessarily a Russian mercenary.
Thanks, Pauline. I mean, if I can just follow up on that, and maybe Olya can jump in, is this going to be an opportunity for some in the West to sort of this perceived weakness or this instability? Is that going to be an opportunity for some in the West to try to, convince them that enduring ties with Russia is not the way to go? I mean, I don't know if Pauline, you want to say something, and Olya, you want to jump in after, or?
Sorry, I just muted myself. I didn't quite get your question, Alyssa.
Well, I was wondering whether it will affect the way in which countries have been dealing with Russia. I mean, obviously, in the first days, we're seeing sort of calls and reassurances, and the reaction from, the non-Western countries to developments in the last few days haven't been, huge, except for silences or maybe delays in responding. But, will this be an opportunity for people in the West to kind of they've been trying to peel support away. We've seen the US engage in an effort and others engage in an effort to try to peel support away from Russia and isolate Russia. So I just wondered if you had some thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's too early to say right now. I think, again, there's sympathy for Putin. I think for what he represents as a very strong person, as a tough man president who's very much in control of his state and his army and things like that. Obviously, that reputation now has gotten a huge blow. But what he represents in some African countries, or with some African governments, doesn't really change. So I don't think the West should just jump in and say, well, look, Russia's a failed state and it doesn't work and you should side with us. It doesn't work that way.
Okay, thanks. Olya, do you want to maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be an effort to have conversations like this on the part of regional North Atlantic leaders talking to their counterparts around the world to try to make this point of, is this the basket you want your eggs in, and what would you like to do about it? And I think the response from the counterparts in the rest of the world will be, okay, what have you got to offer me that's different, right? Why should I stop doing something that's working for me for all the problems that it entails if if the alternative is nothing? So make me an offer, and then I'll make my judgment on whether I'm sticking with the horse I've got, or if I'm going to change horses.
Makes sense. I just want to jump in, and we're going to open. I'm going to go as much as I can to all the questions in there on this that are from every angle. I just want to also say that if you click answer live on the question you might want to pose, you can, I believe, do that, or maybe I'm being told that's not an option. So, never mind, I will read out your questions and who is posing them, so please continue to put them in the box. I mean, one of those has been about the reaction within Russia, the reaction from the elite to what's going on, and the reaction of the public. Olya made a point at the top of the conversation about how Prigozhin didn't exactly represent the same kind of opposition as, although his protest was cheerleaded, and maybe Olya can speak to this as well, and as Oleg from some abroad that share very different political stripes, including Khodorkovsky, that he appeals to a different kind of public in Russia. What kind of conclusions can we draw, though it's very difficult to say, from the mood among the elite and the Russian public? Oleg, if you could speak first, and then maybe Olya or Simon or anybody who wants to jump in.
So the first reaction of people with whom I spoke with on Friday and Saturday was that everything was staged. They didn't believe that the real rebellion was happening. They didn't believe at first. So because I explained why, because everybody believed that Prigozhin was a Putin guy, that Putin was behind Prigozhin. And what Prigozhin was doing is because Putin wanted him to do this. I mean, they really thought that the conflict between the Russian military and Prigozhin was happening because Putin wanted this conflict. And it showed that Putin didn't trust the military, and he allowed Prigozhin to attack the military. And of course, in the beginning, they thought that this rebellion, it's like a cover operation to get rid of the part of the military from Putin. Yes, it was. So it was like a Putin special operation to clear the military. Yes, and then after that, then Putin said that it was a treason. Yes, when Putin was on TV, they understood that it was absolutely real. And after that, they understood that Prigozhin had a real opportunity to take over Moscow.
Who's worried about their jobs today, if I may, then?
So, and they understood that Prigozhin had a chance of his life to become a dictator, or to self-proclaimed dictator, and nobody would be able to stop him because there were few forces in Moscow, and they didn't have heavy weapons, it seems like, Prigozhin. Yes, and after that, Prigozhin stopped. Nobody still don't understand why he decided to stop. Nobody has an answer to this question. Nobody has an answer to the question why he accepted this deal. As far as ordinary people is concerned, so of course some people they got scared because a number of former prisoners with heavy weapons and with military training were moving to Moscow, and what they could do in Moscow, you can only imagine. Yes, and some people were observant, and even some people who were pro-Putin, they tried to keep distance and not to do anything, and just to observe what will happen in the end. And that's a very interesting reaction, yes, because we saw in the beginning of this conflict that part of the military were paralyzed. They didn't do anything to stop Prigozhin. We don't know why. Nobody stopped him, but everybody was informed. Yes, and again,
So, Alex,
a lot of people were paralyzed. Yes.
no, I just want to follow up with a more specific on that. Going forward, who do you think? Do you think we will see kind of purges? Who's worried about their job at the moment?
I think the real people who, because Putin knew about this, yes, and he could only blame himself for what happened. He could prevent this crisis, but he didn't do this. Again, we don't know why. Yes, but of course, the military at the beginning also didn't do anything. They couldn't stop Prigozhin, and if they knew, the best thing that Shoigu and Gerasimov did, they just disappear. That was their response. So maybe I can't exclude this. Maybe Putin would do what Prigozhin asked him to do. So to ask to fire part of the military. And he said, if you remember, yesterday he said that that Russia should incorporate more and more people with real military experience into the Ministry of Defense. Maybe we'll see this process gradually, because Putin, he's not a big fan of quick decisions. Yes, maybe we'll see some purges in the FSB, maybe, we don't know, in the GRU, because they also knew about the operation, but maybe Putin didn't believe them. He preferred not to think about this, or maybe they gave him bad information. We don't know. Again, we'll need some time to see what happened.
Yes, we will need to see what happens. I mean, one of the things that, and this is a question just now in the chat from colleagues in the Finnish MFA, is, one of the conclusions to draw has been that this showed that Putin's power vertical, that his way of kind of staying above the fray and letting his people fight it out and keeps them on edge, keeps him in power, has advantages, but perhaps that has been showed to have flaws at the moment, or pretty. If this wasn't all planned by Putin, then obviously this has shown up the risks of that. Olya, what do you think going ahead? Will he try to take his authority back, and in which way?
So I think it's really interesting. I was actually having an email exchange with a former colleague, Jim Quinlivan, who won't mind that I name checked him, but he wrote a 1999 article on coup proofing, on how leaders try to coup proof their regimes. And the argument that had been made about Putin and coup proofing was that setting up this competition among the security services, among different genres of security service, was how he was coup proofing. And it seems to have backfired, right? And what's interesting is that the competition was for resources and for Putin's favor, but there wasn't, it appears, that much inherent loyalty to the Kremlin as such, or at least not enough to jump between Prigozhin and the Kremlin, or alternatively, as Oleg explained, that they just couldn't tell, right? They were so convinced that everybody was working for Putin, that anything anybody was doing was surely approved by Putin, so that's why they didn't get in the way, which is a really brittle system. It's very, very bad coup proofing, right? You have just completely failed to coup proof if that's what you're doing. So in terms of how do you go forward from here, what I expected on Sunday was a massive crackdown on Prigozhin and Wagner to demonstrate who is in charge. What we've seen is something that's moved a lot more slowly and carefully. And I think the reason for that is concern that there is a certain amount of popular support for Prigozhin and Wagner, right? Not because people think that they're great people or great leaders, but because of this household name aspect, kind of the you follow them on Telegram, and it's kind of interesting. You know who they are, which is why which is why you've got people in Rostov whose response to being taken over by Wagner is to try to get selfies with them. Right? It's not actual support, it's just almost a celebrity response. So I think there was concern in the Kremlin that if you crack down on them under these conditions, that could backfire. So what we're seeing is a slower response. Now, whether that's going to be death by 1,000 cuts, where eventually you do get rid of Wagner and Prigozhin and all of the rest of it, or if it's going to be an effort to co-opt them, kind of on the model of how Russian Empire and also the Soviet Union and also Russia has done when it tried to, in Chechnya and Central Asia, right, when it tried to gain control of areas, right? You make a deal with one group, and then that group helps you get rid of the other groups, and then you eliminate the group you helped, except in some cases you do, and in some cases you don't. So I think this is going to be the thing to watch. Are they trying to co-opt or re-co-opt Prigozhin and company, or are they planning to destroy them? Eventually, co-opt first, destroy later. So, this is what we're going to be watching for. But I also expect them to continue their crackdown on liberals, just in case. And I also expect them to continue to rain missiles on Ukraine, as we continue to see with the attack in Kramatorsk that hit the pizzeria that every Westerner who has been in Kramatorsk over the last few years has been in that pizzeria. So, this is what I expect to see.
Thank you. So I'm going to follow up with a question that we've had from quite a number of people. I'm going to group them together. So there have been questions about Belarus and Lukashenko's role in this. So if I may, Oleg, Lukashenko's been having a field day, if we could say, in his sort of position as the power broker and the savior of the day, whether real or not. How is that going to affect the dynamics? What does it mean for him to have Wagner's forces there? And Simon, you can get ready, because there's a follow-up for you about how Ukraine is watching this and the kind of concerns they may have about, there's always been concerns about a new front from that side. So, Oleg?
So I would say that Lukashenko, Putin, and Prigozhin share a very similar mindset. So they understand. It seems they really understand each other. So, and it's known that Lukashenko met with Prigozhin a lot of times before the war, and he knew him like a Putin's provider. Yes, they knew each other, so they could speak with each other. They could understand each other, and at least it seems that they spoke the same language. And maybe really Lukashenko helped Putin to avert, to prevent the wars. Yes, to prevent the real fighting in the streets of Moscow. Maybe, again, if we believe the official version of what happened. So we don't know how many Wagner people will go to Belarus. We don't know what they are going to do there. I don't think they will be able to protect Lukashenko from local Belarusians who don't like him. So it's hard to imagine to do. There are different speculations what he could do there. And Lukashenko himself said that Prigozhin maybe would need some time to stay in Belarus, and after that he could leave. And he said that Prigozhin would have to pay for his time in Belarus. Yes, so we don't know the substance of the deal between them, but maybe Lukashenko really helped Putin, and of course Putin would remember this in the future. And it's a very interesting situation and quite new situation for Putin.
Thanks, Simon. Do you want to jump in there and also talk about the wider security concerns and how these dynamics might change things?
Well, since the war has shifted to the east, there have always been questions swirling around in Kiev whether a new front might be opened from Belarus to attack Kiev again, or to attack one of the highways that lead west from Kiev to the Polish border, where most of the Western heavy gear is being transported towards the front. This question has been around so much that Kirill Budanov, the head of the military intelligence, has recently said in an interview that he doesn't answer that question anymore. It's been ruled out for him that this was going to happen, and indeed, it's quite unlikely, even with more Wagner presence in Belarus. This would be seen by Ukrainians and by Western satellite pictures, as we remember has happened before the full-scale invasion. The build-up was quite visible, and it wouldn't be a surprise attack. The territory is very unfavorable. It's mostly swampy territory, and there's a big river in the way, the Pripyat River. So there are narrow roads that can be mined easily, and they have been mined, so that any force from attacking from there would need quite a lot of heavy equipment, which is what the Wagner Group has just been stripped of. So I think it's unlikely that they do any big-scale attack that Kyiv would require. And even raids like the ones that we've seen Ukrainians and Russians doing into Belgorod are quite unlikely. I think the Ukrainians would attack them immediately, I think, and they wouldn't be able to secure any territory, which would be, of course, necessary to stop Western military aid flowing in. And there's one very far-fetched scenario. There's a nuclear power plant, the fourth nuclear power plant that the Ukrainians have on one of these highways, about 120 kilometers south of the Belarusian border. Also, I mean, that's a scenario that's been mentioned in some corners, but I think it's very unlikely that anyone in Belarus has the force to do that right now. Of course, Wagner's presence there will somehow affect Lukashenko's role in this war. So far, we've seen Belarus only as a staging ground. Now he's giving refuge to this very violent force in Belarus, and we might see more attacks from the air. Most recent air attacks on Kyiv and other cities on Ukraine have been conducted from the Caspian Sea. That might change a little bit, but I don't think that this constitutes a new serious danger to Kyiv or to Western military supply.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to shift a bit. We're shifting continents back and forth because we had the privilege of having Pauline here for another perspective. We had two very specific questions about dynamics on the enormous continent that she follows. How is this going to impact developments in Mali and the opposition to jihadist forces there? And that was a question quite early on. And there's a question about Rwanda following in Russia's lead and providing mercenary services and what kind of impact this might have.
Well, I think the Malian military leadership has reasons to be nervous right now. They have asked the UN peacekeeping mission to leave. The French left more than a year ago, about a year ago. And they have about 1,000 or 1,200 Wagner troops stationed up in the north, which is already becoming more and more insecure, with Islamic State in the Greater Sahara fighting JNIM coalition. So yeah, it's a very tricky situation because they, they're relying on Russia now. This is their main security partner. If there are any changes in the Wagner deployments, this will be a huge problem for them. That said, Wagner hasn't really made a dent in fighting insurgencies or pushing back jihadists so far. So Wagner has been there. So politically, it has been very important to show that Mali, wants to show that it's taking its own destiny in its own hands. It can choose whatever partner it wants. It can choose Russia if it wants to do so. So politically, it's been important, but militarily, we haven't seen much change on the ground. Wagner there relies also on help from the Russian Defense Ministry. So again, we will see if Russia decides that Wagner should be completely dismantled and maybe rebranded under a different name or under some different kind of outfit or company, then it can continue. And I don't think it's a very costly operation because it's only 1,000, 1,200 men. I'll stop that here. Sorry, what was the other question, Alyssa?
The other question was about Rwanda and presumably whether this would give a second wind to their efforts, but about Rwanda following.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I did see the question come by about Rwanda, sort of labeling Rwanda as a mercenary group. It is not a mercenary group. Wagner definitely is. Those are mercenaries fighting for money. The low guy, the rank and file. Mali has a professional army and uses that professional army to do military interventions in Mozambique, in CAR. Although that's not technically a military intervention, and now it's talking with Benin to see if it can deploy soldiers there, usually to either train the army, help with equipment, in the case of Mozambique, to actually fight insurgents. But we can't label it as a mercenary force, but say, again, speculative, if you're now at this point in time, you want some security help, would you then, as a government, think about Wagner, or would you think about Rwanda? Then Rwanda is probably a much more attractive option, because here are soldiers that are actually directly under the authority of a government. And with Wagner, we know that's no longer the case. So we no longer know how this works exactly. Again, Rwanda is a small country. The army has its limits. It can't just deploy anywhere in Africa, but it's true that Rwanda might look more attractive at this point in time.
Thank you to covering that. Two very specific and very interesting questions. I'd also like to look now a little bit more at the near abroad. We had a couple of questions about the impact to the region that we cover with Olya. We've seen already that the impact of Russia's invasion in Ukraine has been far and wide, with countries in some areas hedging against their ties to Russia, in other areas it affecting the diplomacy around frozen conflicts, or the diplomacy post-fighting in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Olya, I mean, how do you think that this is going to affect things? Is it going to accelerate those developments, or are we going to see some bigger shifts?
I thought it was really striking that of the relatively few leaders that Putin spoke with prior to Prigozhin turning his vehicles around, were the leaders of Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. We have a sense of what happened with Belarus. We have no sense of what happened in the conversation with Mirziyoyev of Uzbekistan, but Tokayev of Kazakhstan basically, gave his own readout. His people gave it their own readout after the conversation, and it amounted to what's going on is an internal matter in Russia. And much as Oleg described, a lot of Russian military, civilian elites deciding they were going to wait this out and see what happened. Apparently, so were a lot of people around the world. And we also saw this. I mean, the Chinese also did not comment until after. I think the war, the full-scale war in Ukraine, and what it has revealed about the limitations of Russian military power, were already making Russia's neighbors rethink their fear of Russia. It doesn't mean Russia is not a threat, but it changes the ways in which Russia is a threat, and their assessment of the reliability of Russia as a partner. This accentuates all of that, right? This is another example of it's a different sort of Russian weakness, right? If the first weeks of the war showed that the Russian military wasn't all that when it came to either its planning or its capacity to do things, this shows that the Russian government and its power vertical isn't all that, that there are real cracks in that foundation. Now, the Russians are going to try to shore those up, but I think if you're a neighbor, you're looking at that and you're thinking, interesting, not that powerful, not that capable, possibly volatile and dangerous from that perspective, but not what we thought back in January of 2022.
Thanks. I'm going to just follow up with that with another question in the chat and then come to Oleg with some more questions about internal politics. Olya, what are the risks and the contingency scenarios that people were looking at from abroad? I mean, your expertise is in non-proliferation. People sort of gave scenarios of, chaos in a nuclear armed country. How seriously should we take those?
My expertise is in nuclear weapons strategy and occasionally arms control. Non-proliferation, it's much nicer world. Look, I think if you're worried about Russian state collapse, you are worried to some extent about control over the nuclear arsenal. If you're worried about a change in government in Russia to a nastier, more thuggish government than the nasty thugs currently running Russia, you are worried about what they might do with the nuclear arsenal. What you should know to inform your worries is that first, it's really, really, really hard to steal a nuclear weapon. And that includes from Russia, and that includes all sorts of nuclear weapons. They are under a lot of control, and they're under control by people who actually care about keeping them controlled. And then second, even if by some miracle you were able to gain control of a nuclear weapon, operationalizing it is really, really close to impossible. So kind of from that perspective, that loose nukes fear, this isn't really high on my list of things keeping me up at night. In terms of unpredictable people gaining control of the arsenal, unpredictable people are currently in control of the arsenal. So, it's pick your risks. There's one hypothesis that having something really, really serious having responsibility for something that's really serious sobers you up and makes you a more rational actor. I'm not sure that's holding up terribly well. But, in order to actually use a nuclear weapon, that also has to go through the military. And the military, and especially the people in control of nuclear weapons in Russia, do know what they're doing. So, you can sleep a little bit more soundly due to that. And then, of course, you have the scenarios, Russia falling apart at the seams into various countries. I do rate those as really unlikely, though, again, my predictive capacity, like everybody else's, is limited these days. I think under those conditions, you do start thinking about what sorts of negotiations are needed to make sure that nuclear and other weapon mass destruction infrastructure, right, including labs that develop, if not weapons, since it's illegal to develop weapons, then antidotes and so forth, which those it's legal to do. You want to make sure that all of that is controlled. And, again, really, really low probability, but it's high risk, I suppose. So you do want to think about it at least a little.
Thank you for those sobering reflections, and maybe some of us will sleep better at night. There was a question about private armies in Russia. We know that Wagner wasn't really officially, private military contractors didn't exist for quite a while. And then Putin came out and said that the Russian state has been funding Wagner as a big admission this week for the long time. But obviously, if we look closer, there are other actors. There were questions about Kadyrov's forces coming to Putin's aid with Prigozhin's challenge. So I guess a two-part question, I'm kind of bundling together a couple of things that I see in the Q&A is, what can we expect from those groups? Is there going to be new concerns there maybe about Kadyrov's forces, or instead a new reliance on them and maybe some of the other forces that are available to Putin outside of the regular army, whether it's Rosgvardia or others. And the other question is Prigozhin too important to let go?
Too important to what? To whom, sorry?
To let go. Is Prigozhin too valuable to Putin still?
He was valuable, it seems, yes. And at once he made a mistake, yes. As far as private military companies are concerned, I think So there are different military companies. Yes, Gazprom, for example, it seems has its own mercenaries. Some oligarchs also have its own mercenaries, but they are relatively small. Wagner was the biggest organization, and it became bigger during the war in Ukraine. The Minister of Defense also has like its own mercenaries, but now they all have to sign these contracts with the military defense. And Ahmad Kadyrov forces, they signed this contract. Yes. So as I said, there are two approaches to this problem right now in Russia. The first approach is to legalize the military companies, and the second approach is to get rid of all military companies, to ban them. So we don't know what will happen in the end, but there are these approaches. Yes, but of course, in any case, if they even try to legalize them, to legalize such a phenomenon, yes, they would have to control their growth and to observe them very strictly, yes, very carefully, especially from the FSB, yes, from the SSB, the second service of the FSB, which is responsible for constitution and all of this anti-constitutional conspiracies. So that's the answer for now. We don't know, but yes, there is such a problem. But it seems that for now they are going to incorporate all of them into the Ministry of Defense. Yes, what will happen next? Will they legalize or ban at all? We don't know. It was Prigozhin there. He was very valuable. Yes, as we know, Prigozhin was in the Kremlin since 2000s. So he was there. He was well connected. He knew everyone. So because there were different theories who was overseeing Prigozhin. Yes, like Kovalchuki or Zolotov or Putin himself, but it seems that Prigozhin played his own role. Yes, and he played his own role for Putin very effectively. And it also seemed that he had his own political ambitions, and nobody believed that he had any political ambitions. Everybody thought that he was just a Putin oligarch who wanted to become the oligarch like Deripaska or Kovalchuk's brothers, to be on the same level with them, because Prigozhin was not a chef. Yes, he said that he can't cook. He was a waiter for Putin, and he played a role as a waiter in his events. And for him, it was so this war could make him a kingmaker. But in the end, it seems he failed because he made this mistake.
Thank you, Oleg. We've gotten past the hour, and I see our attendance dropping a little bit, although we've had a great number of people here asking a great number of questions. Please stick. I'm going to ask one last question from me to everybody or anybody who wants to jump in, but I'll try to manage that. But please do stick anything in. We've got a couple more minutes. And otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to name check everybody or answer everybody's questions. So perhaps just a final thought from everybody, if I may. It's been a lot of speculation, a lot of waiting to see. We're still really waiting for things to play out. So if I may, what's the key lesson that you may have drawn for this? And I'm sorry if I'm going to go negative rather than optimistic. What is the biggest concern, perhaps, from the events? Olya, will you start us off?
My key lesson is one I keep learning, which is that the Kremlin does not think the way I think. And if I'm trying to predict their behavior, the way to do it is not to say, what would I do if I were them, but what would they do if they were them, right? And that's a much harder exercise. I would say, you didn't ask this question, but the lesson not to learn, right? You should not walk away from this thinking Putin is doomed, right? You should walk away from this watching the space very, very carefully. But, don't assume that because there's a problem, it's all going to go in that same direction, or that it's all going to, that it's, the collapse of Russia is inevitable, and nothing more. It won't take anything else. It's just going to collapse from within. I'm not saying it won't. I'm just saying don't count on it, and continue to make your plans in a way that accounts for a variety of different possibilities. As to what I'm worried about, I mean, I worry about I worry about so much. I worry, I suppose, first and foremost, I worry about more attacks on Ukraine, right? And I worry about the war getting that much worse. I worry about the war continuing for a very, very, very long time. And I also worry about the future of European security if this Russia, this very messy, this very broken, this brittle Russia walks away from this conflict thinking it is successful. I really worry about the repercussions, not just for Europe, but for the world of something like that.
Thank you. I've just gotten a message, as you were saying, from Oleg, that Putin's in Derbent in Dagestan talking about internal tourism. So there's certainly an effort to show that business is as usual in Russia. Please, book your next trip to Derbent. It's a lovely place, I must say. But on that note, it's not to bring levity to that moment, but I wonder if Oleg, Simon, Pauline, do you have any thoughts that you want to add as we sort of wrap to the end of the hour?
I just want to add one line. So for me, the main question, why Putin behaved as he behaved. So he was either misinformed by his security and by the FSB or by the military, or he was unresponsive to their warnings. And that means that he lost his sense of risk, and he maybe lost his grip. We don't know. But he behaved in a very strange way. And why he allowed this conflict between Prigozhin and the military? Why he discredited the military by allowing the military to be insulted by his waiter. Yes, this is the question. Why? And of course, I'm curious why Prigozhin stopped. After he went all in, after he went to a direct conflict with Putin, why he stopped?
So more questions and answers. Simon, see you.
I think that for Ukraine, this has been sort of a glimpse that what is possible, but it's clear that there's no shortcuts towards a Russian collapse, and there's no clarity about whether it's going to get any better. So what they will do is try to inflict more frustration on their soldiers, trying to peddle the message that Putin is not in control and that the reasons for the war that he has put forward are bogus, as Prigozhin did on the day of his mutiny. And the other valuable lesson that the Ukrainians will take away is that you need to be in control of all your units, even the ones that are very branded and very visibly independent. Ukraine has been very careful to keep their volunteer battalions in the fold of the Ministry of Defense since 2015. Their financing is quite complex, but it shouldn't be a problem as long as the war is going well for Ukraine. But as soon as they have to make painful compromises, I think they will be very careful now to be sure that they know about the loyalties of all the units fighting for Ukraine.
Thank you, Simon. I mean, I think I'll just, say in our concluding thoughts, for your work, for Oleg's work, for Pauline's work, and Olia and I's work in general, in the conflicts that we cover, we would love to think the optimistic scenario is this will push Putin or others for negotiations or for a compromise solution, but we're not holding our breath. So there's still a lot of watching and waiting and mitigating some of the worst consequences of this instability and of the conflicts that we cover. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. Thank you to all of my colleagues for taking the time to share their analysis and their perspective. This will be on our YouTube channel if you want to watch again or send it to somebody else. And we hope to see you again soon somewhere else in another context to continue the discussion. Thank you.